As leaders, we're constantly talking about how to manage stress, conflict, change, and anxiety. But what if all that overwhelming organizational turbulence, the restructuring, the shifting teams, the projects that suddenly vanish, was rooted in something deeper, something we rarely name in a business context? Think about your own professional life right now. Are you feeling mentally or emotionally exhausted, maybe even noticing yourself withdrawing socially without being able to pinpoint the exact cause? Have you felt the tension of knowing a massive change is coming long before it actually lands and struggling to maintain your integrity while leading your team through the anticipation? Do you find yourself or your team rushing past milestones, straight into the next big thing, never quite making space to honor what was just finished? And perhaps more importantly, are you carrying emotional energy from past professional experiences that didn't feel complete or closed? Today, I'm once again joined by Suzanne Fox to explore these questions and more.
Welcome to Space to Lead, the podcast where leaders and teams come together to learn, grow, and thrive. Each episode brings fresh insights and real conversations with leaders and industry experts who are shaping the future of leadership. We explore strategies to build dynamic, engaging cultures, whether you're leading from the front or making an impact within your team. So take a deep breath, make some space, and let's lead together.
Suzanne, it is such a pleasure to have you on the show again.
Thanks, David. I'm really excited to be here. Heavy topic, but I think one we really need to be surfacing.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to this conversation because you had put out a brief video on YouTube about the topic, and you made this statement, and it really caught my attention. You said many leaders are navigating endings, some clear, some ambiguous. And often there's grief in the room, whether it's acknowledged or not. There's a lot in that statement. So I'd love to just hear what sort of coming from, what sort of led you to that statement and this work that you've been doing around grief.
Yeah, thanks. It's well, what I can say is with my individual clients and actually some of the teams I'm working with, I'm there's this underlying tone of so much change, so much overwhelm, lots of layoffs in all sectors. And when we start to talk about that, what really comes up is it's loss, it's grief, it's how do I move through that? And I think sometimes we still just think of loss as the death of a loved one. And the reality is any kinds of personal, professional, or collective transition or change surfaces these emotions of grief. And it really disrupts our normal way of being in meetings, in teams, and just showing up at work. So, personal loss are those things like a death of a loved one, divorce, health challenges, and those also show up for us in workplaces. But we have these other losses that I'll call professional losses, which are I lost my boss, my team dynamic shifted, the project I've been working on is no longer viable, we've decided to stop it. And those things, when they matter to me, can put me or others in a place of grief. I think the other thing we're seeing is a collective loss, right? So we have personal losses in our professional life that might impact just me. I'm no longer leading a project. I lost a team member. My boss moved on. And as a collective, we have losses because we're doing layoffs. We lost something significant in the organization. It's a merger. We have this collective loss. So there is a ton of grief that is surfacing. And if we don't start to recognize it in ourselves, and especially as leaders, we really can't help teams move forward and on.
Yeah. And it was so fascinating when I first saw the conversations that you were having around this idea of grief. It really struck a chord, and it was interesting because it's the first time I've really heard of it framed in that way. Because we often work with leaders and talk about things like stress and conflict and
Mhm.
change and anxiety and overwhelm and all of this stuff. But
Yeah,
I'd never heard of it framed as grief. It's quite fascinating.
it is. And it's absolutely critical that we label it for what it is. We go through all the emotions, right? Kübler-Ross's stages, like we go through them. And the one thing I think that is important for leaders to understand is there's also something called anticipatory grief. And I want to touch on it because when we know our organization's going to go through a structure change, or we know there's going to be layoffs, there's an anticipation that comes through that. So that isn't, we know this, it's a response to an impending loss, right? It hasn't happened yet, but we know it's coming. And they are distinct because anticipatory loss really, or anticipatory grief really heightens the anxiety for when the loss happens. So if I can actually start to recognize I'm in that anticipatory place, I can start to manage it a little bit differently. And so that's really important that we understand that many leaders are, especially if you think about, I'm going to be laying off some of my organization, we've got a merger coming. There's going to be anticipation. Am I one of the ones that's going to go? How do I stay in that place of being a great leader when I've got my own emotions? And never mind that, lead my team through that.
Ah, gosh, that's really resonating. I just had a conversation with an HR leader who
Mm,
has been part of substantial restructures and change in an organization
mhm,
for months and months, quite frankly.
mhm,
And I had never really thought of this. They actually have now left the organization, but because of their role, they handled all the change, all the departures, knowing that at some point it likely could affect them and their team. And lo and
mhm,
behold, it did. So
mhm.
imagine holding all of that
Yeah,
tension and grief.
yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and I'm coaching leaders right now who are looking for resilience and looking for ways of managing through this, knowing they may be next. And so how do I hold myself in my integrity? And you can. It's I always say to people when we're in these things as leaders, coaches can really help people manage those emotions and support themselves to see what's actually happening for them, right? So there's lots of characteristics around what happens when we're experiencing this, right? So, heightened concern, we may have lots of overthinking, that cognitive rehearsal of things, what's going on in your brain. We have physical and emotional symptoms. So, we could be exhausted, really feeling tired, seeing our teams feel tired. We can have grief in what I call time zones. So, past, present, and future. So I'm grieving in all of those zones and I'm not sure how to manage those things. And that is mentally and emotionally exhausting, right? And of course, social, right? We can be seeing people withdraw. I don't know how to use my voice anymore because I've got all of this emotion and I'm not moving through it. So, as a leader, it's kind of our responsibility to understand what's showing up for grief for everybody. And I have a CEO that's on the series we're doing right now who spoke about that he doesn't actually hasn't seen to be affected by endings or loss or grief, but he recognized he's got a gap in his leadership and not understanding what's happening for his teams. And he may have been just bypassing some of that. And there's now behavior starting to show up because there wasn't an ending that was done well.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. So it's not only about me, but sort of being aware of the impact of those around me.
Mhm,
You mentioned that you've been having these type of conversations in some of the work that
mhm.
you do. How are people responding to this concept of grief in a business setting? How is that showing up? Because it feels like a kind of a new lens to look at all this stuff through.
Yeah. I have to say I'm completely surprised at the number of people showing up to the conversation. So I just put on with a colleague of mine 4 series. We're only halfway through. And the conversation is so rich. And what I want to talk about is why it's important that we do endings well as leaders, because it actually surfaces and names the transition very clearly and also honors who might have left or what project might have been stopped. And when we do that, it allows people to talk about it, resurface some things, talk about their sadness and maybe the disbelief, but also park that and say, I've had my time to process, and now I can still look forward. With the leaders saying there's still good things and we want to honor what has been. And I really use the word honor because I think that is something we need to do. And it doesn't, when I think about teams that have lost a leader, and it doesn't always have to be from a layoff. A leader may decide to take a new role, a leader may decide to retire, but has a team that is a big fan of that leader. And now all of a sudden that leader's gone. That is a loss. The new leader coming in needs to acknowledge and honor the predecessor and actually say, it must be hard for all of you to have a new leader. I know you had great relationships. And I know I've not done that. I can say, in my last role, I did it because I've learned through this process, through myself, that I need to help people acknowledge. And it's up to me to honor what I'm taking over, that I'm going to take the good bits and I'm going to change things. But that's because I'm a different person. And that's honoring what I've been given and letting them sit in that space. So we
Mm.
need to do endings well. We need to talk about it.
Yeah, and I love this idea that you keep referring to it as space. Of course,
Mhm,
we know why, space to lead, right? But
mhm.
it really speaks to an important thing because there's so many pressures, so many demands that it often is on to the next. What do we need to do
Yeah.
next? We don't create space to celebrate our wins, to honor these losses that you're talking about.
Mhm,
And what's really coming loud and clear from what you're saying is if we don't create that space or room, at some point, it's going to trip us up or it's going to trip the
yeah.
team up. So
Yeah.
go fast, or sorry, go slow to go fast,
Mhm,
creating space for honoring this loss, this grief, whatever may have caused it,
mhm,
is so
mhm,
critical for the effectiveness of
mhm.
our individual leadership as well as us and our team.
Yeah. And on this series, because we had one yesterday, one of the leaders there talked about, now that she understands this ending piece, that they had an ending a little while ago, but the team just was hanging on to things and she couldn't quite understand why. But she also didn't understand what she was hanging on to. So they got in a room and they did an ending well. They talked about that person who had left the organization on their own accord, but something new and exciting for them and what they were all feeling. And she said, even after months, it allowed people to actually say, oh, it did mean something to us and we valued that person. And now we've talked about that in a way that honors them. And now we can move forward in a different way. She said it just cleared the air.
Ah, interesting. So that kind of connects to something else you said because you'd made this statement. It's about making space for what's true so
Mhm,
something new can begin
mhm.
cleanly, clearly, and honestly. What does
Yeah.
that mean?
Yeah. So I want to just quickly take us back to a little bit about why we go into these stages of transition and what's important and why that statement resonates. Because when we don't do endings, which is letting go of the old way of the working, of relating to whoever, we can't move into what is the neutral zone with Bridges' work, which talks about that in between. There's this time of confusion, there's uncertainty, there's anxiety. But you know what else happens in that neutral zone? Creativity, where we actually get to think about moving into a new beginning, which is where the clarity comes from. So, back to your space, we need to do that work because in that work, in the messy middle, in that neutral zone, all of those things can come true. We can put back what we need to put back because we're ending it well, but we can move into new ways of moving forward and talking about and embracing new identities, new patterns, new ways of being that allow us clarity and consistency with the leaders help to get us there. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. And it's funny, you can't see it's a podcast, but I was smiling because you referred to it as the neutral zone. And it
Hmm.
was interesting for me. Neutral sounds easy. And I immediately
Hmm.
was thinking of Sam Kainer's work and the groan zone because,
Right.
as you're describing all of this transition and all this
Hmm.
movement, it can be a little bit crunchy and difficult sometimes. So that
Hmm.
groan was
Hmm.
kind of coming to mind for me.
Yeah, and I think Bridges would also tell us the neutral zone is where there's confusion and complexity and anxiety, right? But that's that. I think he's referring to it as it's the zone of what's going to happen, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's messy.
Yeah,
It's
no, for
messy in
sure.
that zone.
And for our listeners, we will put links into any of the resources and tools that we
Hmm.
refer to in the show notes so you can learn more about those models and concepts.
Hmm. Yeah. So I just was curious, David, if you wouldn't mind, when have you been in a place of having to end something and what have you done to end it well?
Well, human nature, what comes to mind is the things that I haven't done a good job of ending well.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
think I think it's actually this subject that you're talking about is important for leaders, but it's also really important for us as coaches.
Hmm.
And I can think of times, either in individual engagements or more so in team engagements, where it didn't feel like we put a proper ending on it. And
Hmm.
it could be that the team I was working with went off and they were fine and did their thing. But I found that I was carrying that,
Yeah.
that it didn't end well or it didn't feel complete.
Hmm.
And similar to what you're describing, I think that it takes in a lot of emotional energy. Like it's a lot to
Hmm.
carry that around if something hasn't ended well. So while I don't know that I've perfected endings, it's something that I'm becoming more and more conscious about. And one of
Hmm.
the things to answer your question, sorry, that was a long-winded way to get here, is starting things with the end in mind.
Hmm.
So, if, for example, if I'm working with a team, um, talking at the beginning about what outcomes we're looking for, what we're hoping to achieve, and what the end would look like, so that we're not suddenly getting to the end, stuck in the neutral zone or groan zone of what do I do now? Like it's sort of
Yeah.
done, but we haven't really completed or closed or ended in a
Hmm.
nice way. So I find that preparation and setting the stage early on actually helps with the ending. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And I think what I love about this conversation is we're actually talking about it. Because it's just not something when we're running from meeting to meeting or running from project to project and the fast pace and the reactivity we have in our world today that we actually need to just be okay with taking. It doesn't have to take long. And I think we've talked about this in a previous podcast. There's this thing that leaders sometimes feel like all of these conversations or these moments must take time and I've got to schedule it and I don't have it. This can be a hallway conversation of just asking somebody, you're probably missing your old boss right now. Tell me about her. Tell me about him. Tell me about them. What happened? What did you really love about them? Which can help the new leader step into some really concrete data on how to lead the team forward with clarity.
Yeah. I love that because it's a theme that comes up over and over. We don't have time to have these kind of conversations with our team. It takes too
Hmm.
much time. There's too much to do, too many pressures. And it's such a good reminder that while initially it might feel uncomfortable, if we make it part of our practice, exercise that muscle, very simply, these type of practices can be integrated into the day to day.
Hmm.
We don't need to
Yeah.
overly complicate it. Yeah.
No. And some key takeaways I want people to be thinking about is grief is part of leadership. I wish somebody would have told me that a long time ago, right? That it just is part of it. Every time you move to a new role and leave a team behind, that's grief. Anticipatory grief, if we don't talk about it drains our energy exponentially and we need to be surfacing it. And the last one I'd say is doing endings well creates trust and space for renewal. So
Beautiful.
this is important.
And I can only imagine, as you've been speaking with folks who have joined your sessions,
Mhm.
I imagine that there's this collective sigh of relief when, one, they can put a name to what they're feeling,
Mhm.
and two, that realization, oh my gosh, I'm not alone in this. I'm not alone
Mhm.
in feeling this loss,
Yeah.
this grief.
Yeah. And you know what? I've got to talk about what one of the participants said in the first session, and he's lost his job recently. And we were talking about the ripple effect of the emotion of grief that he was feeling. And I'm just so thankful that he put it in the space, because not only did he leave a team, an organization that he was fond of and loved, the ripple effect on his family and trying to help his wife and his children navigate their grief because of what he was feeling. So the ripple effect of this emotion and this process is extensive. So how do we start talking about it?
Yeah. Yeah, because that's so critical because that ripple effect, if we try and hold it in and manage it ourselves, could have very unintended consequences on those around us, work, family, community. So the more, to your point, that we're able to name it, surface it, have those
Hmm.
conversations, doesn't
Hmm.
mean those feelings are going to go away, but then
Hmm.
we can sort of intentionally move through them, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that comes up for me, because I'm grief certified in loss, and those of you listening, I'm a registered nurse by background, and I worked in critical care for decades, and saw a lot of loss from a death perspective. And one of the things I've learned is when somebody loses a loved one, they still want you to talk about them like they're here. They want you to use their name and not skirt the issue. And I just wonder, when we lose a boss or we lose the project or we lose a team member, are we still talking about them? Are we still using their name
Mm,
to actually make them human?
wow. Such a powerful reflection, observation, whatever you want to call it. And I'm already in my mind, not going to talk about the situations on the podcast, but thinking of a couple situations where there was fear to use someone's name. Don't
Mm-hmm.
mention, we can't talk about, and the
Hmm.
impact that that had on those people that were left
Hmm.
behind. Yeah.
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 Yeah. And so when those things happen and we can't, I'm going to say it again, end well, they resurface, and it can resurface two, three, four positions away. So there could have been a CEO that left a company six CEOs ago, and there can be things that were not ended well with that role that get carried on because the patterns and the behaviors that stay there.
Gosh, yes, you're speaking my language because we talk a lot about those kind of things when we're working with teams, about
Mhm.
these patterns of thought, patterns of behavior,
Yeah.
sometimes invisible to us because they're so ingrained into the culture of a team or organization. And some new reflections for me because I haven't necessarily connected those patterns
Mhm.
to an ending. So, Suzanne, gosh, you've given all of us a lot of things to think about when we think about endings, when we think
Mhm.
about introducing this idea of grief in a more professional setting. If someone is wanting, just as we work to a close of the conversation,
Mhm.
if someone is wanting to have more effective endings or work
Yeah.
towards having good endings, where would
Mhm.
they start?
Name it. We have to name it. We have to name the transition. Get some support if you've got your own feelings and you're unsure of what those are, but we have to name it. That's how we start the conversation, and we need to hold the space for people to talk about it. And sometimes once we can name it, we can frame the transition or the ending of something into a new beginning once we've talked about that messy middle, the neutral zone, the groan zone. The first step is we've got to name it, and we have to actually understand that we are grieving. And if you need support to do that, there's all kinds of people in the world that can do that. Trusted colleagues, coaches, counselors, therapists. There's lots of people that can help us surface what's really going on for us from a grief perspective. Because grief is not just about loss of a loved one. It can be the loss of the beloved boss that you had for 10 years who's moved on to a new role because that's their next stretch. And there's a lot of grief left behind.
I love that. Naming it. And what's interesting for me as that comes up is by naming it, one that
Mhm,
helps me if I'm the leader
mhm.
experiencing that, but it also creates room or space for other people to realize it's okay if I'm not 100% and I'm feeling something too. Recognizing that if there's 10 of us in a room, we all may be experiencing a form of grief and loss, but we each have our own experience and it's quite different. So I also appreciated how you brought in there are many resources and it's going to
Mhm.
be unique to each of our own processes we're going through. So some really great insights there.
Yeah, and I would just offer people to open up your hearts and your minds for your colleagues or those people around you that we may be judging or making assumptions when actual fact they're just experiencing some grief and they just need to name it and talk about it.
Suzanne,
So,
as
David, I want to say one last thing. Before you begin something new,
okay,
you have to end what used to be.
end what used to be. Tell us more.
Mhm. Well, you can't start something new if you haven't let go of what was, whether that's a pattern change, a behavior change, or a human change.
So now I feel like I could go into another 20-minute conversation. I love that. And I'll say this and then I won't go on too long about this, but I often talk with folks about these patterns of thought and behavior and how
Mm,
a pattern or a way of doing things could have served us really well, but may
yes.
not serve us going forward. And
Hmm.
as you talking about an ending of something that used to be, that sort of fits into this idea of an old pattern, a new pattern.
Hmm.
And even though it's a positive change,
Hmm.
there could still be a bit of grief and loss, especially for
Hmm.
something that's very deeply ingrained, because there's
Yeah.
discomfort in that change.
Hmm.
So you've given us a lot to think about, Suzanne. And as always, it's such a pleasure to get into conversation with you. I feel like this needs to be a feature-length podcast so that we can really go deep. So I'm really looking forward to diving into another conversation soon.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, David, for having me again.
This conversation has been incredibly powerful, and I truly feel we've surfaced a topic that is critical for contemporary leadership. We've tackled the heavy subject of professional loss and transition, recognizing that grief is a fundamental part of leadership. It's crucial that we as leaders start labeling the overwhelm, the anxiety, the conflict and exhaustion we see in our organizations for what it often truly is: loss and grief. We've learned that grief isn't solely about the death of a loved one. It surfaces during any significant professional, personal, or collective transition or change, such as things like layoffs, shifting team dynamics, the loss of a boss, or when a viable project is stopped. This process truly disrupts our normal way of being at work. So I challenge you to pause and reflect on the strong emotions you might have experienced in the past, or maybe you're experiencing now. Is there a loss attached to what you're feeling? Could this exhaustion, overthinking, or withdrawal actually be unacknowledged grief? If you realize a loss is present, consider this. What might happen if you created the space to acknowledge and name that loss? I think that was the most powerful piece of our conversation with Suzanne when we talked about this idea of naming it. By naming the transition, you create the room and space for yourself and others to realize they are not alone in their feelings, which allows for a collective sigh of relief. Creating the space to honor what has been lost is absolutely critical for the effectiveness of our individual leadership and the renewal of our teams. It's the work that clears the air, allowing something new to begin cleanly and honestly. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope this conversation has given you a powerful new lens through which to view the challenges and transitions in your professional life. And if you found value in exploring this idea of doing endings well with Suzanne and I, please take a moment to like and share the episode with a colleague or friend who might benefit from hearing it. And to ensure you don't miss our future conversations, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Until next time, thank you for creating space to lead.